This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton.
Greetings.
Who is a potential political candidate
Vice
for
President.
the high rank of Vice President. Since we spoke last, Buck, has anyone else entered the hustings to compete with you, running for Vice President or trying to appear on television?
None of which I'm aware.
Not a single competitor.
None.
Not one.
None. So it's
an open field. The runway is open.
Yes. So.
Well, I hope you'll keep us posted as to how things work out in regards to these political ambitions.
I'm sure that the news will cover it very thoroughly.
Right.
So
Let's keep an eye on this. Keep an eye on that. Well, on that subject tonight, we're going to talk about something that's ingrained in the American psyche, and that's the notion of freedom. Now, that's we hear the word a lot, we see it a lot, but the people really probe the concept of what freedom does or doesn't mean. And I'll start off by tossing you a softball and asking you, what are a couple of freedoms that Americans would hold dear? What freedoms do we have?
Well, you say it's ingrained in the American consciousness, and I'd say that was certainly true down to the mid-20th century. I'm not sure whether that's such a big deal for us anymore. You hear a lot, if you want buzzwords, and freedom, of course, is one of the great American buzzwords. I would argue that it's really been replaced over the last 50 years by two other buzzwords, security and equality. So with that proviso, I'll give you my thoughts on freedom.
Yes.
I would say that the first step in defining it would be, are you referring to freedom to do something, freedom to be what you want to free, freedom to engage in what activities you want to engage in? Or are you referring to freedom from external constraints to make you into something you don't wish to be? I think.
Okay, well, good. I think that's a good way to consider the situation. Well, I think the words that you spoke about, important buzzwords. One of them being equality, but I think they interface with freedom. Mm-hmm. And I would say that you could imagine, this would be my concept, you could imagine there's a circle around you, and within that circle, your will is paramount. So you're free to do as you wish. You can do whatever, and there's no restraint on what you do or don't do. That would be sort of the basic idea. And the issue, what happens is when that circle you could say to do, it inevitably bumps up against other people that also have their little circle around them. And if your circle impinges against them, your will impinges in their little space, then they have to be freedom from your will, if you want to say it that way.
Yes.
So the idea is that if you have a very restricted world where you're not too much, what you're doing doesn't impact people too much, you would have a broad bit of freedom. And if you're in a very tight little world on the subway in New York City, your freedom would be quite restricted. And how to balance that circle, what you want to do and how it could impact other people, parsing that out turns out to be extremely difficult. And there's a certain naivete when the word is used as it in common parlance is. So what's great about America? Well, it's a free country, or this is a free country. You've heard that said. Maybe we could explore that a little bit. So if we accepted the analogy about the little circles around people, that's sort of a way to consider freedom of speech, freedom of action. So maybe we could say something about freedom of speech. So presumably, that's why it's a free country. You can say what you wish to. However, there are substantial limits to that. You could go in a closed room and presumably say whatever you wanted to, or if you had a circle of people that you trusted, and you knew what their predispositions were, and you made some kind of comments, it would not impinge on their freedom. On the other hand, if in regards to the freedom of speech, if you were listening to another person and the person was insulting you, and you would feel like that their freedom of speech had been excessive. So can we probe that a little bit?
Yeah.
And we can get into what the government does in regards to freedom of speech.
Yes, and before I go quite down that road, I'm glad that you picked speech as an example.
Yes.
I mean, you can use freedom in many different contexts, but speech is a good one because your initial comments with your bubble analogy, I think you were thinking of freedom in terms of physical space, and there certainly is an element to that. But it's not just physical space either, and I think speech is the best example of that. Look at the continuum of belief. Within the confines of your own brain, your own mind, your own cranium, you are free under our system to believe whatever you wish. For instance, and I have to be careful here, we're on the air, but the idea of threatening the life of the president is in fact a federal offense. Whoever the president is, I'm not
Sure.
picking choices, but you can think whatever you want about wishing a president or any elected official dead, and you have total freedom to do that. Once you begin giving voice to those thoughts, there begins to be some restraint. Now, that restraint is by no means total. I can say certain insulting things. I can say things that a lot of people strongly disagree with. That's the reason we have a First Amendment. If everybody said things that nobody else had a problem with, we would not need a First Amendment. The First Amendment is designed to protect unpopular opinions, designed to allow you to give voice to those opinions without being shut down. Now, the purpose of speech, presumably, is to influence action. So if I wished a public official dead and I said I thought we ought to go lynch the public officials or kill the public officials, you can make a good argument that that speech is not being uttered in isolation, that I really am attempting to bring about a coup or a revolution or something. So once you get to action, obviously the government can constrain action. If I were to pull a gun or something like that, the government can stop that. So the big issue is, well, since speech is designed to produce action, and action sometimes can be curtailed, where does the wall come down? Where do you say you can't do this anymore? So there are a lot of big issues regarding speech. What speech is allowed and what is not?
Well, firstly, yes, indeed. And so the issue is what people might say is, well, you have your circle of freedom, whatever that is, and within this circle, presumably, you can think as you wish. You can, as long as you are not going to impact on anyone else. However, it's not just science fiction to discuss mind control and what happens by in communist China back in the Mao Zedong days. You have like periods of confession, we confess, whatever. So the government was also trying to purge any wrongful thoughts from your brain. Additionally, what happens is an external organization can change words. We can have doublespeak. So the words that you have in your brain that allow you to come up with your own conclusions can be poisoned by external agencies that remove certain words and certain concepts from the common parlance. So there's no way that your brain can actually get into an issue of consequence because the currency of thought has been altered by an external agent for bad reasons, you could say. And just to go along with that, let's remember that speech is more than just talk, but it's also communication. So, for instance, we had the famous, I don't know if you can read the communist eras, or maybe Hitler's giving a speech and all the flunkies are just shouting or clapping their hands. And you could say in communist Cuba, to say that's the way people, you watch them, I mean, people are just just jumping up and down and yelling, and that's great. And if you don't respond that way, if you're just tepidly clapping your hands, people are watching and something bad could happen to you.
Well,
or you could, if you were in, let's say, you can see that, for instance, in Congress. If you're the Democrats, the Republicans are there, and I don't know, whoever the president is, whichever party, the other party just sits there and doesn't clap, and the other party is just jumping up and down and yelling. So communication is complicated. External agencies can have an impact on that, it's as I was saying, you're in a subway, you're just surrounded by other people. You have a complicated world. What you can freely express has substantial limitations that are externally imposed. And is there a difference, just to go along with that, as to, we say this is a free country, just to say it that way, and let's say a very unfree country, we'll pick North Korea, and we'll discuss how does the government in North Korea control speech as opposed to the controls that we have here? What would be the difference?
Oh, plenty of things to unpack there. I'll back up.
No, I went through a lot.
I'll back up a little bit there. Well, yeah, certainly the context of the environment is very important. One of the most famous statements of freedom of speech, of course, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. talks about the clear and present danger of shouting fire falsely in a crowded theater and causing panic. What if the theater is not crowded? Then if you're not on that crowded subway, maybe you have a little more freedom to say things. You also bring up the mind control. You mentioned doublespeak. One of my favorite thoughts about that comes from 1984, when a section of the Declaration of Independence is put forward. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that wouldn't translate to the language used in 1984. All of that entire paragraph would simply be reduced to the single word, crime think.
Yes.
I think the difference is that while the government will not blatantly try to compel that kind of coerced thought, coerced conformity in thinking, society certainly can. And we see that. So once again, if I may have the First Amendment freedom to say something, I don't have the First Amendment freedom to have society stand there and cheer me on and agree with me. That my words may render me anathema. But that's a social situation, not a government situation. You think of Norman Rockwell's freedom of speech cartoon, where someone is standing up, uttering something at the town hall meeting when people don't like.
Very powerful.
But political correctness, this is an attempt at mind control that emerged on America's college campuses in the 1980s and has just gained ground. The idea that you will be exposed to social opprobrium for using certain words or uttering certain things. As for the government and as for Korea, obviously with modern technology, bugs, listening devices, stool pigeons, re-education camps, these are things that we don't have.
Do we not?
Yes. Now, a lot of people will say...
We'll ask that question.
A lot of people will say, yes, but American government, look what it's taught or traditionally was taught in public schools, that Americans were the greatest country on earth, that white American culture was the best, that European-based culture was the best. That's true, but we always have the ability to dissent from that. And the example that occurs to me immediately, the flag salute cases in the 1940s. The Gabaitis case in 1940, when a Jehovah's Witness did not wish to pledge allegiance to the flag, and the Supreme Court ruled that, well, no, we can make him do that. 2 or 3 years later, the Supreme Court very quickly revisited that and said, we goofed. That was really an un-American thing to do. If you don't want to pledge allegiance to the flag, the government in a public school does not have the authority to make you do that.
After the U.S. was winning the war, may I say, so which is an issue. Mm-hmm. So I mean, we could probe a little bit the difference between North Korea freedom of speech and freedom of speech in Macon, Georgia these days. Well, if you say unpopular things, I'll try and similar kind of conversation. Well, let's say a person criticizes the president of North Korea. Just starts to, well, what is going to happen I'm not sure of their legal arrangements, but many times countries, for instance, Syria would be one of them, there's sort of a state of siege going on. So the country feels so threatened that anything that any attack against the government, it attacks against everyone. And it would mean, by the North Korean party line, well, maybe the capitalists would come in and shoot people and throw babies in fire. And so it's desperately important that the government not be impinged upon. Thus, it would be a crime to freely criticize the president, and bad things would happen to you, and not only you, to your family. So the power of the state would be so overwhelming in regards to that. Additionally, the state would discourage the possibility of coming up with your own independent opinions by a very compelling imprinting that goes on. You mentioned textbooks, which is a big deal. So the child is the father of the man, whatever, say that. But the impulse that you receive when you're young, what's right and wrong, indeed, your speech patterns are all imprinted at an early age. And so there's a tremendous amount of restraint society exercises in North Korea in regards to freedom of speech and indeed freedom of thought. And I'll now flip to the American situation. One issue there that some people would say was, and they're attempting to change this, was gender pronouns. I mean, I found it a bit laughable. I mean, okay, you can't use he or she. I don't know what you would call people, but the idea is that the fact that these gender pronouns are in our speech, then that causes substantial inequality and destroys human dignity, and it's bad. So if you're using he or she, that's bad. And it's C, Dick. If you remember the C, Jane and Dick, or whatever. Do you saw those little second grade readers? Well, that's just loaded with sexist stuff in there, and it's terrible. And I think Jane wore a dress, if I can recollect that. They had a little dog, whatever. I don't know, but they had these imprinting is going on in our country. So we have, to a lesser degree, some kind of imprinting. And you mentioned what would happen were you to criticize criticize the leader. Well, we have such a polarized country. I mean, it depends on what circle you're in. But you could say that if you did not, if you supported the leader in some circles, all kinds of onerous things would happen to you. And there'd be a tremendous amount of psychological pressure. People would slam doors. You could be shunned, almost like the Amish would shun people. You would have your business tossed out. Academic promotion would be tremendously curtailed. Becoming president of the company would be terrible. And you would face boycotts. If you were the American, whatever Trump's had around, people would beat you up, possibly. I'm not sure if the government would do anything, but I don't think if you were praised or criticized Trump, I don't think they would do something. But the powerful forces would essentially restrain what you're up to. So there would be substantial problems with free speech. And on campuses, the idea that if you were to support, I mean, in general, not always, and not everywhere, but that there would be a suppression of anyone that attempted physically threatened, the same way the Nazis would do it. Now, I'm not supposed to talk about Nazis. I know that means you're off subject, but nevertheless, it's a little joke, isn't it? I do think the extreme efforts to impact free speech are being enforced by the government, and in this part of the world, freedom of speech is substantially limited by lots of reasons. And if we could go back to our little circle that's out there, so if you're in a situation where your sense of from is that freedom, my freedom is from you and from your ideas. So I want to protect it, and indeed your culture, or the freedom of any the way you look. I don't want to have to look at you. If I see you, it disturbs me.
Are you talking about a microaggression here?
Well, I could. I'm
Yes.
selling that into, but the circle that's out there is becoming extremely powerful, and when those walls are put in place, it does substantially decrease freedom of other people. So to say, we're on that narrow subject, but their ability to express themselves is out there, and also a subtle kind of mind control is exercised. If you, I don't know, let's say, I don't know, you're an Alabama football fan, and you just happen to be in the same room with 20 Auburn fans, and they're, I don't know, whatever, they're watching football or whatever they're up to or discussing things. And the idea is there's a large force that goes along that prevents you from, saying how good Alabama is or whatever. You sort of just go along and clap when Auburn scored, possibly, maybe not. But that's some of the issues that are out there. And just to continue on the subject, I think the question that comes up is this a free country in regards to different things? And I think you could go down a list, and what I would finally submit is there are degrees of freedom that are present in different countries. No country is absolutely whatever they are, although North Korea might come close. And so it's a relative kind of concept that's changing. So say the freedom of speech that someone might have let's say you were a segregationist or whatever in that White Citizens Council meeting or whatever 50 years ago, whatever you could say, you certainly could say and espouse whatever views that are quite incorrect these days, that you could do that. You can't do that now. And contrary-wise, other people can express views, for instance, on communism. I mean, maybe communism was pretty good. It's not altogether bad. I'm sort of an arch socialist. And if you were saying, say in Macon, Georgia in 1952, you were espousing communist viewpoints, then you would not be free. So there always been problems with free speech in that part of freedom, and it is normally restrained by these societal forces.
Yes.
Now, if you have a comment, then I'll make one.
Yeah, well, just once again, I do see the difference being social pressure versus government pressure. And of course, a lot of our concepts of free speech and even free exercise of religion came at a time when we had the frontier, we had the safety valve, we had lower population and more physical space. But there always does need to be some degree of discretion in your exercise of free speech. So if I am an Alabama fan in a room full of Auburn
Yes.
people, then I probably would be best served if I had discretion not to say anything. On the other hand, if I did not have that discretion and I voiced the honest opinion that Auburn was terrible and
Yes.
I want Auburn to lose or whatever, I am not going to make any friends in that room. However, if I made the statement like that, I think Alabama is good and Auburn is bad, and they proceeded to beat me up,
Yes.
then the government would take my side. I could find them liable in tort. That does not, the fact that they are offended by my speech does not give them the legal right to visit bodily damage on me.
Well, I mean, fire in a crowded theater, I mean, so to speak. I mean, you could make the argument that a person was doing an incendiary thing to disturb whatever. I mean, I won't ever kill it. The assumption is the system would be fair, and it's a rather trivial thing. You could, I mean, we could make the analogy more distressing. I mean, we could do that.
Yes.
I guess one of the things going on, we're on sort of a narrow part of freedom, but the internet, and so what's going on with that. And so presumably, if you see what's out there, people are expressing in the way this was allegedly supposed to happen, where you're supposed to be able to say whatever you wanted and there was no regulation out there. Well, the Chinese government immediately saw as part of their control apparatus, they couldn't allow that, nor in Cuba, as far as that goes, to pick another communist country, you could say that. And so the government basically put limits on what's on there. They take people off, and I think the joke is let's see, the Chinese premier, people have likened him to a teddy bear. Is that right?
Yes,
and
I
so,
think so.
if you sort of just accidentally talk about a teddy bear on any public media thing, the censors
The
take
great
you
firewall
out.
comes in.
And
Yes.
the power of the internet to watch you and keep an eye on you and do this and do that, and particularly in regards to what you say and ergo what you think is pretty powerful.
Yes.
Artificial intelligence can do that. And many countries that require their life in a submarine, they require a very a limit of personal action, to put it mildly. That's out there. And so in this country, one of the things that allegedly started out with you can say or do anything you want, and then presumably what happens is bad forces can use this communication for bad purposes. And the idea that the Russians were going to use the internet to plant things, do things, and then people that are the mass shooters, the person that shot everyone in El Paso or whatever, apparently had been corrupted, if you want to say that, by listening to opinions that were onerous or lead to violence and bad actions. So there's going to be a responsibility to limit what you can listen to or hear. And indeed, in regards to the control issue that's out there, if the government or an entity has the ability, maybe I don't know, Amazon or Facebook, they can really, by what you communicate, they're able to get a real handle on what you're up to. Thus, if you get really pretty paranoid about this, you would not easily communicate without people reporting back for some presumable punishment or some kind of restraint on your activity, because the idea that freedom and freedom of speech and communication leads to evil actions, what people would say were evil. And thus the responsibility of the government is to limit free speech. And free speech would only be possible in narrow circles where there was where society was not under any threat. So if you sense that any conversation is okay, society's not under any threat, but as particularly in the United States, the country becomes more fragile with centrifugal forces and sharp elbows, and people are having problems with the concept of community. The government would appear to be at least considering, or some portions, substantial limitations. So just to continue with it, the question would be in World War II, we have this famous Norman Rockwell painting, The Four Freedoms, which we've only spoken of one of them, and we can parse the others out if we had the time. But I'm not sure how much free speech you could really observe. We made the talk about the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, we're going to win the war. Okay, the people that were the Japanese were put in, could be reasonably called concentration camps. Well, they're turned loose, and the war is about to happen, and later get reparations from the experience. But the more society is under threat, the less easy it is to, or harder it would be to express your opinions. So I'm not sure what would have happened if you had said, I hope the Japanese win, or we caused the Pearl Harbor by our restrictions. There was a natural thing to happen for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor because we embargoed oil. And so many, in fact, historians say—
jump in there. Herbert Hoover was writing pretty much that same thing in his private diaries while it was going on in retirement. I would say yes, and I think this is a good thing to finish up on, that in every major American war, you see that kind of security. Civil liberties get put on the back burner. The Civil War, certainly, yes. World War I to a big degree. World War II, although that was not as noticeable because we were so united. The French Revolution that we were on the fringes on. I think the difference that we've got today is that sense of threat is not from an external enemy. It's from perceived internal enemies. And that means that we have to turn this against American citizens, sort of like in the Minority Report movie. Well, he's wearing a MAGA hat, and that means he's a threat, and we need to crack down on that. And that's an existential threat to the First Amendment. And that's a very terrifying thought to me as a civil libertarian.
Well, that was very, very profound, as usual, Bucky, and I'll shake hands with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
I wish you luck on your vice presidential ambitions.
Stay tuned.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.